Thank you, thank you. I'm not quite sure how you follow such a great introduction, but I'm going to give it a go. And I'll start by just very briefly introducing myself. So I'm Sairah, I'm CEO of AlphaGo, and we create and build brands in the world. But really my big passion is behavior, studying behavior. I like to watch people and I like to watch things. And that means professionally, I get to do that every day, building brands as we often think of them as we do people in terms of how they behave and show up in the world. And academically, my interest is in digital sociology, as the guys mentioned. No one knows what digital sociology is, although I know there's at least one other digital sociologist in the audience today. But if you think about the invisible hand that guides a lot of our behavior, and how we get socialized in the world. Digital sociology is understanding behavior online and thinking about how we interact with technology, how we interact with technology-driven objects, how those objects talk and communicate to one another, what they get up to when we're not around. So behavior is the thing that I'm really interested in. And right now is a really amazing time to be in the world talking and thinking about this topic because of how everything is accelerating around technology so quickly. So we're at a moment in time when there's a lot of stuff happening. We're at the brink of, everyone's talking about the digital revolution and specifically how AI is going to accelerate what we know of the future and this kind of fourth industrial age, as it's often called. I had the privilege of speaking at Collision earlier in the year, and I ended with quite a profound story, in my view, around Adolf Eichmann and his trial at the end of the Second World War. And when he was on trial, he claimed that he was simply doing his job, and that his job was, in essence, to make the trains run on time. For the rest of us, that job was about making it far more efficient for trains to take people to concentration camps, and he was operationalizing the mass destruction of human beings. Quite a different way of interpreting that. And Hannah Arendt, who's a political and cultural theorist at the time who covered his trial, she had a view about what would have made a difference. A lot of people around that trial talked about empathy and how if he and others had been more empathetic, we wouldn't have ended up in the situation that we did. And her point was quite different. She said it had nothing to do with empathy. It had to do with thought and being more thoughtful, and that if we'd taken a step back, we could have ended up in a very different position. And my invitation to everyone then and to myself was to take a step back and think about where our future is and how AI might be driving that future before it takes us over and becomes too late, perhaps. So some of you are probably familiar with Nick Bostrom. He's a philosopher at Oxford. He's an Oxford philosopher. He's much loved, his book's much loved by Elon Musk and Bill Gates. It's called Superintelligence. And he has this view that we're moving even beyond artificial intelligence to artificial superintelligence, and that the future is coming down the track very quickly. So by 2060, a lot of the AI expert community think that we'll be into the age of artificial intelligence, and it will be here and it will be life-altering. That's 43 years' time, 40 years' time. So that's going to be within the lifetimes, I'm sure, of most of you in the room, if not all of you in the room. So we don't have that much time to prepare and think about it, not as much time as we might think. So just to make this feel a little bit more tangible and real, 2 weeks ago you would have read, just like I did, about Google's AlphaGo project and program, where they've built a program to play the Chinese game of Go, which is very complicated, and the machine, with no human help other than being given the rules, learnt how to play Go better than anyone else in the world in 3 days. 72 hours. I don't know what constitutes a good, productive, long weekend for any of you, but that's pretty good going by anyone's standards. So if that's what you can do with a program in 3 days without any help from humans, and that program can now teach us how to play Go, can you just begin to imagine all the things that are possible in the future? So as we're on this kind of journey, there's obviously quite polarizing and extreme points of view, as there often are, around what's going to happen. So Ray Kurzweil is the leader of a movement called Singularity, as you probably know, and in his view of the future, it's going to be amazing. We're going to be living entirely different lives. It's going to be the kind of future where we're enhanced, we get to live for longer, we get to be our best selves, we're going to be healthy, we're going to be happy, and in fact we're going to get to the point where we overcome mortality itself and we're going to live forever. Meanwhile, back to Nick, who is Swedish, so European as I am, perhaps has a different view for cultural reasons as well as intellectual and academic ones. He's not the optimist that the American Ray is. In his view, when it comes to AI, we're so far out of our depth that we don't even realize it. We're like small children who've been sat by an open fire with a load of knives around us and told that we can play if we wish. So in his world, the future could be very different and lead to our destruction, and he's not the only one who thinks like this. So I think Stephen Hawking has said it could also lead to our destruction. He's got concerns about it that I think he voiced in the opening ceremony yesterday. And even Elon Musk shares a kind of similar view. He mentioned that it could be the thing that starts our third world war, and that was off the back of a comment that Vladimir Putin made recently, that whoever wins in AI could rule the world. So really quite extreme points of view. But they're not new. So Norbert Wiener at MIT, when he first saw one of the early learning systems play a game of checkers back in 1960, before I was born, he made similar observations, that we better be very clear about the purpose that we're building into machines, and that purpose is going to come out the other end as something desirable to us. So who should we trust? You know, in this world where there are so many unknowns, who should we turn to for some advice? And who can we trust to give us the kind of advice that is going to land us up on the right side of history? Well, we could look to governments, couldn't we, in states? It's an obvious thing to do. But they're not always very well placed, I wouldn't say, to kind of look after us and protect us in the ways that historically we might have expected them to. For a start, this is a global topic, one that needs to be quite joined up in how we think about it. And nation states are literally that. They think about themselves first to some degree, especially in the political climate that we have at the moment. They've got their own electorates to think about, not just the world, so that might come second. They also aren't necessarily able to act very quickly. So if you think about the bureaucracy behind a lot of those state engines, how do you move that in the right direction at speed? And in terms of resources, as voters, we don't necessarily want them to be spending all of their resources on just one topic, and for that topic to be what's going to happen in the future around AI. So they have to make lots of different bets around where to spend their resources. So those three things alone are enough to not necessarily make them the best entities to give us the kind of advice that we might want in this area. And they're not, the people within these governments aren't necessarily best placed to give us advice either. So the Treasury Secretary in the US earlier this year, Steven Mnuchin, he was asked about the impact of automation on jobs in the US, and he said at the time, it's so far out in the future, it's not even on my radar right now. And we just talked about 40 years before all of this becomes part of absolute everyday life and could be all the things that everyone talks about. That's 40 years. So that's something like, 10 election cycles. So maybe it's not on his radar, but it should be on someone's, that's for sure. And it's not necessarily much better in the UK, where I'm from. So the leading party right now, the Conservatives, had their party conference last month. And Amber Rudd was asked about encryption. And she said at the time, I don't much understand encryption, but I think it might, it could be kind of useful for criminals. Amber Rudd, and she's one of our more respected politicians right now, she's responsible for national security. So she kind of ought to have a point of view on this stuff, I would hope. So what kind of political regime or context or framework should we look to that might be helpful? Is there one? Possibly not, but there are some interesting things going on in the world. In China right now, the government there is investing heavily in AI. So they are investing in quantum computing, and they're building a research unit to the tune of about $10 billion. And it's going to be ready in 2 years. It's going to be ready by 2020. So there's going to be an awful lot of machine power in the world, if you like. They're going to be building the kind of capability that combines the capability of all of the computers that there are in the world at the moment. I mean, that's such a big thought to register, to think about what you could do with that kind of computing power. So that's the bet that the Chinese are making. Aside from politics and states and institutions in them, should we look to tech companies to help us? It's an obvious thing to do, isn't it? Well, they certainly can act at speed, and they certainly have resources. This little lot up here, I think they're worth the GDP of a relatively small country, Ireland, where a lot of my family are from. So they've got resources, they've got deep pockets, they've got speed, and they're certainly investing. So McKinsey did a study last year which suggested that they're spending something like 20 to 30 billion on AI applications. That's what they spent last year between them. So should we trust them to look after us? Well, ultimately they are responsible to shareholders and investors. They're not responsible to you and I as voters or as individuals. So their agendas aren't being ruled necessarily for the greater good, which I think we should keep in mind. Although they are trying to do some very good things. So they're combining themselves to get involved in AI initiatives to set up working frameworks that give us a kind of ethical approach to some of this stuff. But they're not going to be able to do that on their own. So, the reality of the world that we're living in now is it's pretty complex. So how do you kind of work your way through all of this? Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things around considerations and things for us to kind of keep an eye on. So number one, as we are creating things, and a lot of people in this room are creating things to do with technology and AI, is bias. So on the one hand, machines can be, and machine intelligence can be incredibly objective. An algorithm, a program, does not care what your gender is, how old you are, where you come from, has no interest in that. So it can be very objective and very unbiased, you would think. And there's certainly some interesting studies. There was a study from Cambridge and Stanford where they were looking at whether you could analyze someone's personality through Facebook likes better than a person's actual friends. And guess what? You can. But at the same time, bias turns up in unintended ways, potentially. The intelligence that comes out is often only as good as what you put in. So if intelligence is formed by creating rules or it's formed by learning behavior, there was a claim last year in the US that within the prison system, when you came up to be judged as to whether you would reoffend in the future, when they look back over the stats, if you were black, you were more likely to be judged to come up for reoffending than if you were white. And that could possibly have been because of there being inherent bias in the data that informed how the system then analyzed who was going to be likely to reoffend in the future. So you have to be careful about the inputs that you use if you want to get a very unbiased and objective outcome. Businesses are doing some interesting things too. So I wanted to talk very quickly about Hilton and their online or their kind of concierge service, which is called Connie, which they're experimenting with. So the idea is that the more questions that you ask Connie as a guest, the better she's going to get at giving you responses, and that over time, obviously, that will be a good outcome for you as a user. So it's learning behavior from the questions that we ask and then giving us the optimum kind of result. Again, that could be very biased in how it happens because it's relying on us as human beings and we're not always that objective. But chatbots are here, and they're only going to improve and get better. There was another, so if AI can help us in lots of ways, kind of small and big, and I want to talk about a big one here. I want to talk about a study from, or rather a clinical psychologist actually, called Alison Darcy from Stanford, who was interested in whether we could use machine intelligence to help us with the massive issue of mental health and depression in particular amongst young people. And what she's managed to develop is an online therapist, effectively. So if you're suffering from a mental health, if you're suffering from depression and you can't afford to see a therapist, she's proved that through the CBT therapies that this chat box therapist can give you, that you will have a very high rate of improvement, as high as if you were seeing a therapist, in fact. So it will check in on you every day. It will learn your responses. It will learn what that means in terms of your mood, and it will give you strategies to cope with that. And it will help you do that on an ongoing, long-term basis. Amazing things. Who wouldn't want to be part of that? So there's lots of interesting things that are developing that have not yet reached fruition. So we've talked a lot about how AI is coming. We've talked about who is going to kind of help us in this context. We've talked about some of the ways in which that's showing up and some of the considerations around how that's showing up. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of the wider business community and the role of us in how the world's shaping up as well. So, interestingly, earlier this year, we did a bit of research. We talked to 4,000 people around the world, and we asked them how they're feeling about the times right now and who they're looking for guidance. And what came through very clearly is that they're feeling very pessimistic, they're feeling very anxious, and they're not quite sure where to turn to for guidance, as I've just kind of explained. And in fact, they definitely don't think it's going to come from the state. 41% of the people that we spoke to believe it's going to come from businesses, and that the business community isn't just invited to do something, it's obliged to get involved and do something. And it has not just the permission, but the resources to do so. That report's on our website at wolfolins.com if you want to see it. It's called Radical Everyone. So in terms of businesses that might be stepping up and taking a point of view about things, I wanted to talk about two very quickly in particular. So I've been studying companies and brands for over 20 years now. And it's been interesting to me to see the line that leaders of businesses navigate in terms of their personal point of views and the values of the company and how they present that to the world, so the kind of ways in which that shows up. It's been fascinating to me in the last year to see that some businesses really are starting to stand up, and I could talk about a whole variety of them, but I'm just going to mention two. So Alan Joyce is the CEO of Qantas, and in Australia they have a vote on same-sex marriage happening next week on the 15th. And he's been an advocate, an activist, and a campaigner on the yes vote for this particular topic for, I think, about a year now. And that's one of the first instances I've seen. I mean, if you're an Australian, Qantas is a national institution, and that's someone coming out on quite a controversial subject, standing up behind something in a way that I haven't seen happen to quite the same degree in the past. And closer to home in London, I was intrigued to see the fashion brand Jigsaw and their campaign just last month, which came out in favour of immigration. So with Brexit, there's been a lot of talk about whether British values are being eroded by immigration, and they came out to say very, very firmly that they're behind immigration and it is part of British society. It's not in conflict with it. So they're taking stances and they're standing up for things in a way that perhaps I haven't seen before, which I think is interesting. And I think that businesses don't just have an obligation to do that, we all do. And it's easy to forget that we all have agency and that we all have a chance to express ourselves and to stand up and be able to influence where AI is going in the future. You're either creating and making things with technology, or you're buying them and consuming them, or you're voting for leaders who are going to have a particular stance on this. Or if you work within these companies, you know, as talent, you're you're critical, and if you decide it's not the kind of business you want to work with, then they have to change their views on these things. So we all have agency, and I think it's easy to forget that, and I'm sure that we would all want future generations to think that when it counted over the next 40 years, we made ourselves count in that story, and that we made a difference in how things developed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about not just the change, but how we try and interpret what we do as that change happens. And I wanted to talk about our philosophy of designing with heart. So when we think about AI, and we're grappling with it as much as anyone else is back in the studio, we spend a lot of time thinking about how can AI be more focused on humanity, and how can it be for humans, and how can it work with us, not against us. And that's how we came up with this expression of designing with heart. And I want to introduce you to a chap called Guy Hoffman, who has done a marvelous TED Talk, which you can find very easily online, called Robots with Soul. So he's in the business of building and creating robots. And he's an alumni of MIT, so he's got a good track record in doing so. And I get the sense that he was quite taken with Pixar and how they take inanimate objects and they give them gestures, make them feel very human, and make us love them in some way. And so he wanted to take a kind of animator's approach to how you build robots and how you make them feel very lovable and like we'd like to spend more time with them. And so there's a lovely film of a lamp that he created, which kind of has an ambient background relationship with him. So you see him moving around his studio, and the lamp kind of comes on when he needs to do something close work, or it goes off. It travels around the studio with him, senses where he is and what kind of light he needs to have. So he applied animation techniques to the gestures that he put into the robotics that he was creating. And as he started to develop his robotic capability, he decided to take himself off to acting school, and he learned gesture through acting and embodied cognition, as he would call it, so how our body expresses what we think, to try and get a more kind of humanized version of what he was doing in the world. He's also a jazz musician, so music is important for him, and he started to think about how we could have an interplay in a different way with the robots that he was producing. And I'm going to show you a couple of little films that I think demonstrate working with robots in a more human way and with us, not against us, and how that can show up, and the interplay between a human being and a machine in a way that feels more optimistic than perhaps we always get the view of. So I love the fact that they kind of end at the end looking at each other, seemingly. There's this kind of relationship rather than a transaction you get the sense of between them. I have another film here of Guy playing music. He's a jazz musician, as I said, and interested in improv, and whether you can jam with a machine, with a robot, whether that's possible, whether it's just sending signals or whether it can feel like you're relating in some way. And so here's where he got to. So I like the fact that there's this interplay and that we can have more optimism around how artificial intelligence develops, and that we can have these relationships together in a way that perhaps we don't always, we talk about the worst case scenarios, not the best case scenarios. And as the intelligence increases, it won't just feel like it's a message, signal and respond kind of a system. You could imagine that you can have this kind of interplay. The last person I wanted to introduce you to quickly is Ishiguro, Hiroshi Ishiguro. If you read Wired magazine last month, you will have read their article on him. And he has been in the business for the last 40 years of creating very human-like robots, so Geminoids. So he's been creating versions of himself over the years, as well as many others, including his daughter. And in going through that process, he's been studying human behavior and how that can turn up in a robot that looks a bit like us, but can create trust, which is a very hard thing to do. You know, if you're sitting in front of a duplicate of yourself, it's a very awkward situation to be in, especially when it feels very much like a robot. And he's learned some interesting things around how, for example, when you sit down as a human being, you're never still. So if you're going to create a robot that has a kind of real quality to it, it can't sit still either. And it's intriguing to me that, and somewhat ironic, that as we get further into artificial intelligence and robotics and all of these things, we're actually spending far more time getting to know ourselves as human beings and how that shows up in the world in terms of our behavior and how we codify it so that these objects can relate to us in a way that we might find trusting or that we might find enjoyable. And I wanted to share these two examples because as artificial intelligence grows, and as our acceptance and perhaps appreciation of a relationship with something that is a machine could develop, you can see how it could do some pretty amazing things in the world. So think about caregiving and the big problems that we have in the world right now in terms of what happens towards the end of your life. Perhaps in kind of someone needs to look after you in some way. Having something in a kind of embodied form, an entity like this that has all of this intelligence that could understand your situation, help you in that situation, be a companion to you in some way. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. I think it could be a very good thing. And to have all of that knowledge at its fingertips, as Alison Darcy has been experimenting with her CBT for depression, you can see where this could go in a good and positive way, not just a dystopian one. So there's lots of incredible things that are happening in the world right now, and like I said before, my key point is not to think that we're outside of the debate, not to think that it's not happening to us, and not to think that we can't influence it in some way. And I wanted to introduce you, if you've not already seen it, to the Copenhagen Letter, which is a movement that I think met for the first time in September, but issued what they see as a working framework and a statement for how we could build better technology, better intelligence together in the world. So it's something you can sign up for, which our tech director certainly has on our behalf at Wolf Olins. And this is just part of the letter. We must encourage a continuous public and critical reflection on our definition of success as it defines how we build and design for others. So let's think about people who are not here with us today, who don't get a say, but who this will affect in the future. And so my invitation to all of you is to think about your role in AI in the future and think about how you would want it to develop and to take some action in how you influence it through the work that you do and the things that you sign up for, things that you consume, things that you vote for. And let's make sure we're definitely all on the right side of history. Thank you.